Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the CTEI webinar hosted in collaboration with the Center for Economic Policy Research. My name is Tamara Pernett. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, CTEI, at the Graduate Institute. Just to give you a little bit of background to CTEI, it's the Graduate Institute Center for Excellence on Research and International Trade. And since its establishment over 10 years ago, it has brought together the research activities of eminent professors of economics, law, and political science in the areas of trade, economic integration, and globalization. It also provides a forum of discussion and dialogue, which is where this webinar falls in. We also want to thank CEPR for their cooperation on this webinar. Just a note on CEPR as well, it's Europe's preeminent network of economists, which brings together over 1,200 leading economists from all specializations. It's a registered charity and takes no institutional position on policy matters. We at CTEI are very much forward-looking to more joint webinars with CEPR, and thank you for this collaboration. Now today, we have an extremely interesting session on COVID-19 and trade policy, where we will discuss some of the key insights from the new ebook, Why Turning Inward Won't Work. But before we start on that, I want to share some technical announcements. Now, first of all, the event will be recorded and we'll be posting it later on the CTEI website. Also, if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Please point them through or share them with us through the Q&A little button that you'll have at the top or bottom of your screen. And then you will receive a short satisfaction survey at the end of the event. And it should take you less than a minute to respond, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on this so that we can improve for future. Now we have, before I start with the panelists, we have also prepared a small poll, which you should see in your screens shortly. The question is, will countries resort to more or less international trade to address COVID-19 related challenges? And we'll see what the results are at the end during the Q&A session. Now today I have the honor to be accompanied by two of the co-editors of the ebook, by Professor Richard Baldwin and Simon Evenett, as well as by one of the contributors, Anna Stellinger. Now, Richard Baldwin is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute, but he's also co-director at the CTEI, as well as editor-in-chief of Vox EU and ex-president of CEPR. Simon Evenett is Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen. He is DLA's Distinguished Visiting Professor at Carey Business School at the Hopkins University and Research Fellow at CEPR. And Anna Stellinger is Deputy Director General of the International and EU Affairs at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. She's Vice Chairman of the Board of Lund and ex-Director General of the Swedish National Board of Trade. Dear panelists, thank you very much for joining us. If I can ask you all to, well, especially Professor Baldwin, to unmute and put your video on, thank you. So I'm going to ask you each to give a short presentation on some of the key insights from your book, focusing on the chapters that you've been contributing with. And if you keep it to 7 minutes, that would be very much appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I'm going to share my screen with you. I have PowerPoint slides here. And I want to just start with the front cover. This is the book which the discussion is playing off of, COVID-19 and Trade Policy, Why Turning Inward Won't Work. It's edited by me and Simon, and it has a foreword by Gordon Brown. We were particularly pleased that Gordon Brown felt this issue was important enough to write a foreword for the book. He, of course, led the exact opposite reaction that happened in 2008, 2009. You remember the London summit, where all the G20 countries committed to not engaging in protectionism and not to put up trade barriers, because they'd learned the lessons of 1929. And this time, it's really not having learned those lessons that's causing all the problems. So what I'm going to do is do a very high-level kind of general introduction, and then Simon and Anna will do the more interesting detailed discussion. So I'll do that. So the ebook addresses a simple question. Should governments react to plummeting national incomes, collapsing world trade, and a looming second wave of COVID-19 by turning inward and further weakening or cross-border commercial ties? That's the question we asked. And the answer of all the contributors, resounding no. Basically, turning inward won't work, especially with export bans, and it won't help us fight COVID. I'm going to say some very general things about blocking trade and manufacturing, and Simon will say things more specifically about medical equipment. Second, it violates basic humanitarian concerns because these kinds of export bans will make it difficult for countries who don't have large production facilities to source the equipment and raise the prices. That will hurt the most vulnerable humans in the world hardest. So it's really a violation of basic humanitarian principles that we would normally apply in normal situations. And lastly, it won't foster the international cooperation that we actually will need to defeat this virus worldwide. Just remembering that until this virus is put away everywhere in the world, it's a threat for the entire world. So let me just go through those quickly. Just quickly look at the shocks that has hit the world. I won't talk about the medical shock because certainly all of you know about that. World trade volume is in the process of collapsing. There's been a number of data points coming out. China had some good data on exports, but by and large, exports and imports are collapsing worldwide. This is from the WTO's projections of what's going to happen. This little dip here is what happened with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And if you look over here, the red is the pessimistic scenario, the optimistic scenario, and this was a trend line. So in the pessimistic scenario, the trade doesn't return to its old level until after 2020. Down here is the income shock, the recession, and these are, you can see many projections. This is from JP Morgan. It's a stylized quarterly profile for US activity in each of the scenarios. So in the downside scenario, even by December 2020, we're still way below the level where we started at. It starts at 100, drops very quickly. In the central scenario, you get a recovery basically to the level by the end of next year. And in the upside, the income is pretty much up to the level it was when it started by the end of this year. And these projections for income are getting worse pretty much by the week. So the central scenario is already pretty optimistic. Now, what we're talking about here is the reaction is export restrictions. The US and the EU, for instance, have export bans on personal protective equipment. China has put in new quality checks, which might be used as export restrictions. But since Simon and Anna, I think, will have more specifics, I'll just skip through this slide. What I want to do is address this argument that they won't work at a high level by pointing out that the three big countries, the US, EU, and China, source a lot of medical equipment from themselves. So this table, which is from our introduction, Simon and I's introduction chapter, if we look at the top 5 importers of personal protective equipment, then you see the US is the biggest importer, EU is the second, and China is the third. So all of these countries are importing lots of medical equipment, which means if all of them block exports, everybody will be hurt. This is a classic example where all of us are living in glass houses. So if anybody starts throwing rocks, the world could be in bad shape. In particular, if we look at the US is the #1 importer of personal protective equipment from China, but China is the #4 importer from the United States. So there's quite an independence on these sorts of things. This independence has actually been growing. So if we look at the reliance of global value chain hubs, manufacturing production on each other's inputs, it was high, it's high now, and for the US and Germany, it's higher than it was in 2008, 2009. So this is the dependence. For instance, if you take Germany, this is Germany's dependence, their entire manufacturing sector, on inputs from the US and China. And the blue line is the US's dependence on Germany and China. And red is China's dependence on US and Germany. As you can see, China's dependence has not risen very much as their manufacturing sector has grown so quickly. But for the US and Germany, it's now much higher than it was before, suggesting that if the US in particular starts getting aggressive with export bans, it could come back and hurt it, make it difficult for American manufacturers to produce. I'll just take a very quick look at a more general level. So what we have here, this is from a blog I put up on Vox a couple weeks ago. It shows the exposure of the row nations manufacturing to the column nation manufactured inputs. And you can see here's the USA, this is Germany, and this is China. And you can see the three big manufacturing hubs. Many countries are dependent on inputs from those big hubs. And so that's the problem. If everything turns protectionist, there's going to be trouble. So I will skip over the historical perspective because I want to leave lots of time for Q&A. That's always the best thing. Let me make the point about that's immoral and harms poor nations. So these are a couple panels that come from Chad Bowen's chapter. He's from the Peterson Institute, where it shows EU export restrictions on medical supplies would put countries in Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa at risk. So just to take one example, if you look at Senegal's imports from the EU of protective spectacles and visors, it's 50%. So if the EU starts putting on export bans, it's going to hurt Senegal. And if you look over here, the US is very important in Latin America. So Jamaica's dependence upon respiratory and surgical masks on the US, it's 73%. So if the US puts on export bans, Jamaica is going to be hurt. Okay, so let me just end with the ruin international cooperation and just remind us all that we will need to make a few billion doses of vaccines in the next 18 to 2 years if we're going to kill the disease. And that will require international cooperation. There's no way that any single country can do it. And certainly there's no way that every country can do it for themselves. So I'm going to just end right there. And sorry, Tamara, for having gone over a little bit. I will stop sharing and mute my mic.
Thank you, Richard. Simon, can I ask that you unmute your mic and put your video? Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. I'd like to share with you the results of from the book on the study of export curbs and export restraints. The book has 6 chapters devoted to this particular subject for one very important reason. By the latest count, there have been 150 export curbs and limits imposed in the medical devices and medicines sector. Furthermore, there are 38 export curbs at work at present or have been implemented in the food sector. So this has been a pervasive feature of the pandemic era trade policy response that we gave thorough attention to. The chapters that were written and prepared here provide a thorough critique of the use of these policies. The first line of critique is that they have not worked in the past, and there is a chapter on the impact of these export curbs during the commodity price spike, which occurred around 12 years ago. That chapter shows that the export curbs at that time raised the volatility of world food prices and did little to depress the domestic prices of food, and the availability of food did not improve as a result. So this is not a policy instrument that has worked in the past. Secondly, the use of export curbs has disrupted supply chains, and this has prevented production of important pieces of medical equipment from taking place. So the irony is at a time when we need more medical equipment, governments are taking steps which have frustrated the export and the production of needed medical supplies. This is important because there is a dissatisfaction amongst policymakers about the performance of supply chains in the pandemic era. And what these policymakers need to realize is that they are a cause of some of that dissatisfaction. They need to acknowledge their own culpability. The third critique is that export curbs induce copycat behavior and retaliation. And as Richard has shown, there's lots of two-way trade in medical kit and medical products. And so export curbs by one country can induce retaliation by another. And the country that started the problem may find that they have access to fewer supplies too. So in other words, these export curbs are counterproductive in a world where retaliation is possible. The last reason why these export curbs were frequently condemned in the book is that they fundamentally do not address the problem. And the problem we face at the moment is the pandemic has generated a surge in demand in many countries for medical kit and medical medicines. And what we need to do is to find a way to incentivize production. Export curbs do not incentivize production. If anything, they deny market opportunities to producers. So on their own, they are not a solution to the medical shortages which have been found. They're often a temporary expedient which governments resort to, perhaps out of fear. Instead, a much better approach, which is advocated in the book, is to think of an open trading system as providing multiple possible sources that a government can draw from when they suddenly face a huge demand for medical kit. We have to remember that the pandemic does not hit each country at the same time, and we have many producers of medical supplies and equipment, and essentially globalization acts as an insurance device so that if some producers are cut off maybe because of lockdown, others, producers in other countries, can fill the gap. So instead of seeing globalization as the problem, we advocate seeing globalization as the solution. Maybe I can make one or two comments on where we see protectionism possibly going in the future. Here, I think it's important to reflect on the 2008, 2009 collapse in world trade. This was a single shock that we saw, which was associated with the financial crisis. It did not result in high levels of tariffs, which could possibly be credited to the G20 undertakings. Instead, what it did see was a massive resort to trade distorting subsidies. By the end of 2009, around 30% of world trade was in some sense affected or distorted by export incentives and tax-based export incentives offered by governments. So the trade distortions which were deployed 10 years ago were under the radar screen measures, not the salient tariff increases of the 1930s. And that's an important point because governments now are resorting to many subsidies as part of stimulus packages, and some governments are also introducing export incentives as well. So we may see a rerun of that particular scenario. A second thing we need to look out for are politicians calling for supply chain repatriation. There have been some economic nationalists and also some other policymakers who've been making the case that there is an overdependence on China in particular. I would argue that these particular politicians have been using selective examples to exaggerate the degree of overdependence. And in fact, as many of the chapters in the book highlight, supply chains can react very quickly to disruption, and that the private sector has an extremely strong incentive in being able to manage and respond to shocks when they occur. Now, the other point to make about these supply chain repatriation proposals is there are no clear proposals. And so what we have is dissatisfaction and instinct that something must change, but no specific proposals. And so as a result, it's very hard to be able to push back against these proposals, but instinctively they are incomplete, and these proposals, I think, should be held with some degree of scrutiny. Let me finish there and hand it back to you, Tamara. Thank you.
Simon, thanks, and thanks for catching up on the time as well. Much appreciated. Anna, could you share your key insights as well in about 7 minutes?
Yes, absolutely. I'll put on the video as well. Here we go. Okay, I hope you can see me. Everything good, Tamara?
All very nice, thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, I am a happy contributor to the book edited by Simon and Richard, and I have, together with two of my colleagues, Henrik Isaksson and Ingrid Berglund, written the chapter that we have given the title, How Trade Can Fight the Pandemic and Contribute to Global Health. Now, of course, that title is very vast, and the subject is very vast. I will try to narrow it down to just 5 major conclusions, 5 takeaways. First of all, the first of the 5 conclusions is that the coronavirus is global. The economic crisis following the virus is global, and solutions should not, cannot be national. It's obvious that one country cannot manufacture all the medical technology or the chemical inputs needed for the medicines. One country could not innovate or create all the vaccines necessary to cope with the viruses either. And even if one country could do all the everything on its own, it would not be the safest way to make sure that everybody has access to these vital products. So risk spreading here is a superior strategy. And another point is that without trade, some of the vital medicines and medical technology would simply not exist. Now, because these products require very large investments in research and development, and those investments would not be profitable for companies and firms investing if there was not a possibility to also export to the rest of the world. So reduced trade opportunities will reduce innovation, and at the end of the day, also reduce access to health related products. So first point, there cannot be any good national solutions. Now, second point, and I think that it's sad that we still need to underline this, but we do, imports matter just as much as exports. We have a tendency of always talking about exports out of trade balances, and especially policymakers are always looking at the export figures, less on the import figures. But we know that imports are just as important for countries as exports. They provide us with a greater range of cost-effective and qualitative medicines and medical supplies. I think that's obvious. And imports are also needed as inputs to production. And then for exports of many goods, such as chemical substance and also for producing medicine. And on this case, if we have a second after the first round of presentations, I could give the example of Mölnlycke, the Swedish company that has been quite a lot in the media lately, and how various problems with imports actually end up hitting the consumer, the hospitals, and the patients. Now, so secondly, imports matter as much as exports. But then a third point that I think that we need to remind ourselves of is that there is a difference between necessary regulation and unnecessary or harmful protectionism. Because we know that safe and reasonably priced medicines, we need to have open borders. But that is not to say that trade should be unregulated. Because the sectors that we are talking about, medical equipment, vaccines, etc., are tightly, highly regulated, and rightly so. But I mean, there's a vast range of regulations, of laws, of tests, of mandatory procedures to ensure, not the least, patient safety, and that is all well. But unfortunately, on top of these necessary non-tariff measures, there are also unnecessary ones put to mostly protect, of course, the domestic industry rather than the patients. And here we see the import bans. We see also the binational public procurement requirements. And there's also many WTO countries that, at least before the crisis, charge high tariffs on medical devices, medicines, disinfectants, and soaps. So let's remember that there's a very important difference here between necessary regulation and unnecessary and harmful protectionism. Now, our fourth point out of the 5 would be that luckily many countries are taking steps to reduce these unnecessary barriers. And that's the positive news. We see that governments already have removed or reduced tariffs on medical supplies. Countries like China, the European Union, Bangladesh. We also see that some countries have taken steps to reduce the non-tariff barriers, such as Iran, for instance, a country that has removed an import ban on ethanol that is used in the production of sanitizers and disinfectants. And in the EU, we have also abolished the otherwise very mandatory so-called CE marking, provided that the product meets all the requirements for health and safety, of course. And as of April 19, that might have changed, but as of April 19, 77 countries reduced import barriers on medicines and medical supplies. So things are happening. And apart from, in addition to these unilateral actions, there are also some coordinated responses among countries taking place. For instance, the group of 7 countries, New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, Australia, Chile, and Brunei, and Myanmar, committed in a statement at the end of March to keep all the supply chains open and remove the existing trade restrictive measures on essential goods when it comes to medical supplies. So there are things happening. And our fifth and last point in the paper is that more could be done. For instance, we would need to commit to plurilateral agreement on medicines and medical goods. That would be the right thing to do at this point of time. We would also need cheaper and improved access to medicines and medical supplies, not at least for the least developed countries. That can never be a bad thing. This is a no-brainer. This is definitely the right way to go. One way forward would also be to build on the existing WTO plurilateral, the Pharmaceutical Tariff Elimination Agreement, which is also called the Zero for Zero initiative. But building on this WTO agreement, it would need to be expanded to more countries. There are very few countries today, mostly the US, Canada, Japan, and the EU. And we also would need to update with new pharma products, and of course, to extend to cover like medical devices and PPE, for instance. But those, I would say, very quickly, very briefly, are the 5 major points that we are making in our chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a very compelling summary, I believe. I would like to ask the 3 of you in reverse order, actually. Now, things are moving very, very fast these days. And since the book has come out, which has just been about a week, has anything happened that you wish you could have discussed about in your chapter?
So reversed, I guess we start by me.
So if you want to start with Simon and then Richard.
Yes, of course. Well, I guess that one very simple answer to that question would be that we see very contradictory developments since mid-April. I mean, this is just a few weeks ago, it's very recently, because on the one hand, we see that there's an increased number of export restrictions. We see them both for medical supplies, but we also see them for food, for instance, around the world. And this is necessarily a very, very worrying development. It's suboptimal. It always ends up hitting the patient, the consumer, and mostly the least developed countries. So that's a negative development that we keep seeing. But on the other hand, we see something much more positive. We see that more countries are introducing import liberalization measures. Hopefully, we will see more of this. Hopefully, we will see more of the removing of tariffs and facilitating trade in important goods. But I would say that I would try to be positive here, because there are 2 more positive things that we have seen since the publication of this book. One thing is that we have many actors now which are monitoring and putting up databases on trade restrictions and trade actions taken by governments in these times. I mean, we have the Global Trade Alert, of course, but we also have the WTO and we have the World Bank. This is very necessary and a very good thing for the future. And a second positive thing is that the WTO plurilateral on pharmaceutical products that I just mentioned is getting much more attention. It is up on the political agenda, and perhaps there is even, I would hope that there would be a momentum, a political momentum to renegotiate an expansion of this agreement. That would be a very positive thing. So I would say that there's more good coming out currently than bad.
Simon?
I won't repeat what Anna has said, and I actually agree with the final sentiment. I think there has been a lot of good developments, but surely the elephant in the room, which has happened since we published our book, was the potential resurgence of trade tensions between China and the United States. And the brewing concern is that in Washington, President Trump and his administration will lash out again against China in the run-up to the presidential election. And I cannot think of something worse to add onto a fragile trading system at this time than another bout of trade tensions, which I'm afraid our friends in Beijing would probably feel compelled to reply to as well. And this would lead to a downward spiral, which no one needs. So I fear that that's the piece which has happened, which I would add to Anna's list.
Thanks for that. Richard, I'm sure you have, or I don't know if there's any left for you to discuss.
Yeah, Simon has picked up on the one that I would have gone on, but I can riff on a little bit. But we have lots of questions, so we can go with that. It is definitely worrying that the U.S.-China conflict is getting dragged into COVID. And, you know, they've always had problems. But, I mean, it's basically the U.S. is having a war on trade. First, they started against all the non-Chinese allies with steel and aluminum. Then they went on to China, and that's gone on, and everybody's retaliated against the United States. But for quite a while, that got sort of went to bed with this so-called first phase deal. And for the first part of the crisis, President Trump was saying that China had been very helpful, particularly on COVID, and they were doing a good job. And then he started blaming the media for saying that the disease was so bad. And then he started blaming the governors of the states for doing things. And now he's also blaming governors of states. And just recently, he started blaming China for COVID and talking about retaliating, all sorts of crazy things. And that is definitely not a good thing. It's not just, though, President Trump, because the Democratic nominee, or presumed nominee, Biden, is essentially attacking Trump as being weak on China and putting the China trade deal in front of the lives of Americans, a very difficult attack against Trump. So it's getting dragged, but the politics are getting dragged into the disease, and the disease are getting dragged into the politics. So that's really a very, very dangerous thing. I think one very positive thing, I'm not sure it was mentioned, was that the EU Commissioner Hogan has kind of floated an idea of having a plurilateral to liberalize things, and everybody, it could end up being the Committee to Save the World, which includes all countries except one, that being the US. So that's the development I would be interested to, I would have liked to talk about.
Thanks for that. I think we're spot on time, and if you all agree, I would move to the Q&A session with the audience. But we have already quite a few questions coming in. I see you've already been answering some of them on this side, so thanks for that, but we still have a few to go through. But before we do that, I would like to see the poll results, and if those can be shared on our screens, it'd be interesting to see them.
Yeah, yeah.
So, will countries resort to more or less international trade to address COVID-19? So we have 34% thinking more, 58% thinking less, and 10% thinking that it's going to have no impact. So we think more, I guess the audience is more towards the negative side and a bit more pessimistic view on the future, which contrasts a little bit to, I guess, your positive message, or the one that you want to convey in a sense. But I don't know if you'd want to react quickly to that before we go into the Q&A.
Sure, I would like to say one thing is a lot of people think that we understand what this crisis is. And my favorite analogy is that we're in like chapter 3 of an Agatha Christie novel, and some people think they already know who did it. I shared that at the dinner table the other night. My younger son, he says, and the trouble is we don't even know how many chapters there are in this book. So, you know, at the end of this, I'm quite sure that many, many people think that trade was a savior, in particular China's export of protective equipment. And later on, when they started helping with the vaccines, I think the fact that there's multiple supplies will be viewed as a plus. And it's absolutely clear to me that trade in this stuff, as long as the spiral doesn't happen, the actual exports are ramping up very rapidly. US exporting more, China exporting more, Germany exporting more. So trade is actually rising as a result of this. And I think in a year's time, we'll have a very different attitude of how important trade was in helping us fight the disease. So that's
But Tamara, I think we could add also to that question, will there be more or less trade? First of all, it's not countries who trade. Companies trade, and I think that's hugely important to just remind ourselves of that. Secondly, I think that it's less a question of more or less trade, it's a question of trade differently. Because of course the world will look different, the countries will look different, the employment will look different, companies will look different, value chains will look differently, and of course not everything will be nationalized and not everything will be taken back home for domestic production. But I guess, like Simon said, companies will think twice before putting all the eggs in the same basket, at least for some years ahead. So perhaps we will have different kind of sourcing, we will have several value chains, we will have a security thinking of being able to source from different continents, different countries from a company perspective. What's hugely important is that the EU, but also other countries, are not trying to steer this in an inappropriate way, because it needs to be the logic of the company's production and value chains and taking back value chains in order to produce. I mean, look at Sweden, 10 million people. We were beating potatoes all year round without, I mean, we have the biggest multinationals and a huge proportion of very successful international companies, and that's only and solely because of international trade. So of course trade will continue. I totally agree with Richard here, but I think trade will look different and the value chains will look different, not because politicians tell us so, but because companies will, at least for a few years ahead, think slightly differently.
Simon, any comments on your side, or?
I'm not really, only to, perhaps just to add that there is no law which says that trade must keep rising, right? There are plenty of good reasons why trade could rise or fall. Some are perfectly benign, some are pretty bad. So I think we shouldn't focus on the outcome. We should focus on what the underlying causes are. And if it's companies reevaluating naturally the risk that they're prepared to take and where they source different products, that can be fine. If on the other hand, it's governments deliberately putting up barriers to international trade, then that's a different story. So I think we have to focus on the root causes, and that's what the analysts need to do.
Yeah.
And on that, I actually want to jump into the Q&A, and there's a question quite related to the point you're raising, Simon, which is, and Anna, you as well. The question is, might there be any changes in the way that countries and companies, I'm adding here, interpret comparative and competitive advantages, potentially reevaluating certain industries post-COVID?
I mean, I think the answer to that is yes. I think, but in the following sense, that companies, I think, will look at the full risk profile, not or at least a broader risk profile than they have done up until now. There was a phase during the outsourcing craze in the 90s and early part of the first decade of this century, where outsourcing was driven largely by considerations of lower wages. And then companies got smart and realized that productivity levels, quality levels matter. Now they've got an additional set of factors to include as well, and that is the potential for disruption. But they'll also, by the way, be taking account of potential for disruption at home, right? Because you may, if you're a US producer in Baltimore, your supplier could be in Detroit, and Detroit could be locked down. So in which case you may want to source from a supplier in another country. So I think companies will think very, very objectively about different types of risks and how to balance those risks. Yeah. And that I think that's the right way forward. And in some sense, we should let the private sector lead here on any supply chain reconfiguration. We should not let any vague notions of overdependence on China and economic nationalism drive that debate.
Yeah, one could add also to Simon's answer that, I mean, COVID is one example, but we also have tensions with like-minded countries that we thought were safe countries and markets to invest in. Just see how geopolitically things are changing, and safe markets that companies used to think of being completely uncomplicated, like the US market, is not so uncomplicated anymore. So I think that generally has to be more strategic thinking about the supply chains of companies. But once again, that's up to every company, because the sectors vary, the risks vary, and there's no way any kind of political interference could do any good in this way.
If I can just add in on that, I think with the historical perspective that I sort of missed was, we've had three kind of waves, if you will, where in 1929, it was tariffs going up everywhere. And the argument was that by putting up a tariff, you could bring aggregate demand to your market. But since you were stealing it from somebody else and they retaliated, this retaliation ended up destroying aggregate demand for everybody. And in the 2008-2009, as Simon's graph shows, it's in our introductory chapter, there was a big increase in export subsidies. I think you mentioned it as well, because there was in essence an excess of supply domestically, and that doesn't work quite as well if everybody's exporting. This time, it's trying to boost the availability of local supply. And if everybody puts on export bans in an attempt to boost local availability, it could end up destroying it for everybody. So each one of these historical things was destructive in a certain way with their own particular line. But let me just also add on the, there's a number of questions, and I'm spinning it out a little bit, but so in Switzerland, a small country, thoroughly dependent upon food and all sorts of things, we have a stockpile policy. And the government works through subsidies to get private companies and warehouses to keep stockpiles of minimum amounts of things. And that's why in Switzerland, we have never had any shortages of anything except toilet paper for about 2 days. And the same Finland was working with Finland on their commission for the future, and they have one as well. So if the solution to fragility is stockpiles of strategic things, and that is absolutely clear and understood when it comes to food. Now it will be understood when it comes to essential medical equipment as well. Even in the US, they had some, just not enough. So I think the idea of diversifying supply sources, having stockpiles, that's the way you manage risk, not trying to bring everything back.
I have if you can answer this, it's a somewhat related question before we move on to a different topic. And the question here is, what do you anticipate the future of global value chains will look like, given that we're already seeing a globally expansive network of GVC consolidating in response to geopolitical and market risk concerns? Going forward, will we see more vertical integration and geographical diversification?
Maybe I can take a stab at that. The answer to that question is it depends. There are some sectors where I suspect we will see absolutely no change. The formidable competitive advantages that South Asia has in textiles is not going to change anytime soon unless there are very huge tariffs or huge subsidies offered. That supply chain is pretty much locked in. You may find in some other products where there are concerns about too much sourcing, perhaps from 1 or 2 locations, then they may end up have a diversification of supply chains. But you might also see some shorten, but I don't think we will see them completely eliminated. I think the answer is really, really sector specific and context specific, and I fear that overgeneralizing wouldn't help here.
Yeah.
So if I could take a bash at that, I would just point out that global value chains in some sense had a phase. They were really only between northern countries until about 1990. And then there was a big explosion between about 1990 and 2008 in the increasing reliance on global value chains. And that was quite thorough. And since 2009, on an aggregate level, it's pretty much flattened off. And I think that's a lot to do with the technology, because better technology allows machines to do more things, which lowers the labor content, which makes it less important to outsource stuff. So in the long run, basically everything will be made locally, and there will be no trade in manufactured goods. And in particular, it's not repatriating production to then export. It's just stuff is made locally, because when production is automated enough, the labor share is low enough, so it doesn't really matter whether you're paying the worker 40 euros an hour or 4 euros an hour, because you're using so little of it. And then the problems with delays and being close to your customers outweigh. So I think the long run trend is localization of production for all global value chains. But I very much agree with what Simon said, is that if you look at trade in medical products, that's what 5-7% of all world trade. And the big global value chains are in cars, electronics, capital equipment, electrical machinery. That's not really going to change. We may see a big change in medical equipment and maybe pharmaceuticals, but for the vast majority of it, those are the way they are for very good reasons. And especially in electronics and cars, they know all about supply side disruptions already. And so they've found a particular portfolio between cost savings and diversification. And I don't think that one's going to move very much. The talk about global value chains being repatriated, a lot of it's just woolly and wishful thinking by people who don't really understand the facts, I must say.
Yeah.
Thanks. There's a lot of questions, and we might come back to the topic on global value chains, but there is we've talked before about US-China tensions. How about US-EU trade wars?
Well,
Anna, why don't you take that one?
well, I'm not fan of the word trade war. I prefer trade conflicts, and I think there's a good point not to using the rhetoric of belligerent generals. Retaliation does make no sense. It's shooting yourself in the foot, using the military words again. I think that we need to think about what trade is really about, and that we need to go back to basics, because trade war would imply that there is a zero-sum game, that if I win, you lose. There can only be one winner in Waterloo. And trade, the way it looks today, is much more a circle where we're all interdependent. It can be a win-win-win, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a loser. It's easy to start those trade wars, but it's definitely very, very difficult to end them. And I think that we need, first of all, to think twice before going into the rhetoric of war. It's definitely not the case. What I think about the EU-China relations is that we need to think about how Europe is handling China. We talk a lot about China all the time. What is going on in China? What are the unfair trade practices? Are they really doing what they should in the WTO? Why are they not reforming? Are they stealing technological innovation? Is it unfair? Are they blocking? Are they coming with investments that we need to screen because they are necessarily taking over companies who are suffering in the COVID crisis? We are focusing a lot about China. I would like us to focus also on EU, because protecting the EU is never possible, but strengthening the EU is very possible. I'm personally very much fond of the fact that we should strengthen the EU's research and development. We should strengthen the EU as a trade actor. We should strengthen the EU internal market, which is basically the most successful free trade agreement in the world in history. So yes, there will be tensions, and there will be tensions between Japan and China and the US, and we will have perhaps countries not speaking up so much today like Russia or India starting to speak up. But I think that we necessarily do have some homework to do from the EU side also, not just to think about protection, but thinking about investing, thinking about research and development, thinking about being even more competitive, and thinking about what we really need to do and what we really need to protect if something is to protect. So that is not the answer to your question, Tamara. Just a point to say that let's not use the word of war, because this is definitely not a war. It's very interdependent. And then secondly, before focusing on China, we should focusing on how to do our homework better at home in the EU.
Any other reflections, or do you want to hear another question?
Well, I could say is that I think it's the one thing we haven't brought up is the election in the US, which is going to happen in 6 months. And the answer to many, many of these questions depends upon who wins that election. Now, the US attitude towards China in trade is not going to go back to the panda huggers of 10 years ago, but the way that the Trump administration has pursued it is incredibly short-sighted and self-harmful, rather than engaging. That was the plan, to engage in China's form of capitalism through the TPP and other forums. I think Biden, if he wins, will more likely to go back towards that kind of cooperation. And the other, let's say the US-EU trade war, which was that subject of the question directly, there's two aspects of that. One, that trade war has been going on since my father worked for the Kennedy administration, and I was in kindergarten. That's how long this thing's been going on. And some of the things like Airbus been going on for decades and decades. So there's kind of, if you get two of the largest trading nations groups in the world, they will have conflicts. But up till now, they've sort of been dealing with it. And there's a tariff on chickens or a tariff on small cars, relatively small stuff, but it's really just like nothing worse than commercial conflicts. But with Trump in the office, he's basically got a war against trade. He's trying to shut down the WTO. He's put tariffs on everybody, and everybody's retaliated against him. So I think that conflict will get much worse with everybody, but also with the EU if Trump is reelected, and I think it'll go away if Trump is not reelected.
I would be much more pessimistic. I think that the United States will not go back to where it was. I think that a lot of what's going on will also be going on in the future, regardless who is in office. The rhetoric might change. There might be less tweeting and less aggressivity, but I'm not sure that the US will go back to where it was before the Trump administration took office. There's been a change in administration. There's been a change in the public opinion, and I'm less positive than you, Richard, on that note. I hope I'm wrong.
On that point, I'm going to push you towards, well, move you towards a slightly different question where it's linked to looking into the future. Here, one of the attendees is asking you to look into a crystal ball and say, well, the question is not whether countries should turn inwards, which is clearly the answer is no, but whether they will. Where the person says, well, the jury is clearly out. And therefore, what type of prophylactic measures might be needed to reduce this risk?
Simon, you missed the last one. Why don't you start?
You mean I dodged the last one? I'll definitely try and do this one. No, I mean, the questioner has the right instinct, which is that we do need to make the case for remaining open. And I think we need, and we have to educate policymakers again and again on what the benefits of openness are and how companies have sought to extract those benefits and pass them on to their customers. And many of those customers are other businesses who are exporting too. So I think that we need to go back and explain what the benefits of openness are. And I do think we also, and again, this was a little bit the strategic choice that Richard and I made in the book, was actually to keep banging away that turning inward won't work. Because if you accept that turning inward doesn't work, then you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to turn outward? How are we going to engage with the outside world? What do we want from our open trade policy? What are our objectives? And that's a conversation where I think that's the conversation we should be having, not one which is extremely defensive and emphasizing only risks and overreacting to some extreme circumstances that we're going through at the moment. And I would make the point again, which I made earlier, which is that some of the disruption that we're seeing in supply chains is government induced, right? If governments are not happy with the outcomes they're having in supply chains, they should look in the mirror before they look at the private sector here. And I think that's an important point to get across. We're in a phase, of course, an extremely acute phase where we could easily slip into the blame game, and where globalization and all the opportunities which come with it for individuals as well as for companies could be threatened if we don't think about these things in a more systematic way.
Yeah. Well, if I can add something tomorrow to what Simon is saying, we have some heavy work ahead. We need to go away from the dichotomy of globalization being good or bad, trade being good or bad. It's not a question about being good or bad, existing, liking it or not liking it. It's the fact that trade is underpinning so many jobs. Take a small country like Sweden, 1.3 million jobs in Sweden are underpinned by exports to the rest of the world, and we're 10 million all in all. We need to talk about what trade looks like. I don't know how many parliamentarians and governments and politicians you meet, but we all meet them sometimes. And I think we need to re-explain that trade aren't just containers crossing borders. We need to go back to the basics of trade being innovation, people, services, data, all crossing borders and building upon imports being made into exports. It's not easy because you can't do it in a tweet. But I think we perhaps have been too lazy, not explaining that without trade we won't have any medical equipment, without trade we won't have any jobs, without trade we will not be able to have trade if we can't move data, if we can't move services. We still think like a truck company like Scania are actually selling truck, but they are selling transport services. And we need to get this into the minds of those forming laws and regulations and doing the negotiations. The governments, of course, where sometimes we see that the protectionist nerve is a little bit too easy to scratch, that putting obstacles to certain products will, at the end of the day, end up hitting companies, jobs, consumers, and in this case, patients. So definitely, I agree with Simon. We have some homework to do.
I could just take a slightly different tack on that. Is some of the things that we've been talking about, Anna mentioned in her presentation, and Simon as well, these initiatives to actually liberalize in medical equipment, recognizing that, and food, putting on restrictions is bad for everybody. It's narrow-sighted things. And we're starting to see a few small initiatives with the EU is very positive. So there's part of it is, and Simon and Alan Winters have put forth a proposal linking removal of tariffs on medical products with an agreement to not do, or to at least qualify export restraints. Personally, I think we will eventually start going into multilateral talks on export restraints. So in the post-war, when all this was set up, export restraints were top of mind of everybody: wartime shortages, disruptions, embargoes, things like that. So all through EU law, this is the chapter of Joost Pauwelen, they are allowed. And it's each country is the judge, jury, and executioner for these things. So I think what we're finding here is that maybe we want to, a group of countries say, we are not going to put bans on each other's medical equipments or medical supplies when we need them. It's sort of an agreement not to put these bans on. And the last thing is the thing that keeps governments from putting on protectionist barriers on exports or imports is their companies and the domestic special interest groups who are harmed. So there, I think it's important with these initiatives is that no one country in the world thinks they have a veto on stuff. So if they don't join it, doesn't mean it doesn't go ahead. For example, if the US doesn't join this thing on medical, well, their companies, American companies, will lose out. They will then put pressure on America to join. And so the idea that there are lots of trains leaving the station and no one can say, all right, no change leaving, I think that helps with the prophylactically preventing things from getting out of hand, the fear of missing out of the companies for initiatives, liberalizing initiatives that are going on elsewhere.
And there, I think the Mölnlycke example, if I could just take one tiny minute on that. You might have seen it in media. It's been rather talked about. I had a meeting with Mölnlycke 1.5 months ago. If you don't know it, it's a Swedish company in the medical equipment, face masks, but also surgical kits for various type of surgeries, also for hips and knees, etc. And they very early on started being hit by the exports ban intra-EU, because they have distribution centers in the Czech Republic, but also in France, for instance, and all those face masks couldn't leave France, and they were supposed to go to Italy, for instance, or Portugal, but some of them also back to Sweden. So finally, first of all, we had the exports ban intra-EU, which were very suboptimal and not really protecting human health either, because they couldn't reach the patients, and they were stopped, not just by France, I'm not just picking on France, but they were one of the countries starting off with this exports ban intra-EU. Then, of course, we have the export bans joint for the EU to the rest of the world, and that is even worse actually, because Mölnlycke doesn't really care that they will lose out on 15% of their exports to countries outside the export ban. I mean, they can live with that, but the real concern here is the tit for tat. That other countries and other regions and other countries in Asia, for instance, will do the same thing, which we can see also happening, because like any kind of company in this sector, they are sourcing from Malaysia, from Vietnam, from Japan, from North Africa, up to 90% of the equipment that is being distilled, sterilized, and distributed in Europe. So basically, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. Companies like Mölnlycke are happily speaking up. It's a school book example of what will happen if EU, for instance, put this exports ban on, and we go for a tit for tat, and then globally, what will happen is that we will have lesser access, more expensive access to the necessary equipment in a global crisis like the corona crisis, and that will ultimately, once again, I'm repeating myself, hit the patients and the hospitals. So basically, what we need to do is to trade more. We need global trade as one of the solutions to come out of the crisis. And as the virus will probably go around the world and hit back again, it's in everybody's interest that we don't have any unnecessary barriers and unnecessary costs in what is needed to cope with the health crisis.
Anna, I'm going to thank you for that, because you've summed up the session and the book very nicely in a very powerful example. And I think with those last words, I want to thank the audience for joining us. Thank Simon, Anna, yourself, and Richard for fantastic presentations and sharing your insights on this, which is extremely relevant at this time of day. Just a quick reminder for everybody, we've been recording this session and we'll be posting it online on our website in a couple of days. And you will soon receive an email with a link to a survey. It's going to take you just 1 minute to respond, and it'd be great to hear your feedback on this session. Now with that, I want to thank you all and have a great weekend.